Good morning and welcome to the list and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us relatively early on a Saturday morning to this year's Wasserman Forum that kicked off last night with Thomas Hirschhorn's very inspiring keynote address and discussion. I'm Henriette Huldisch. I'm the curator here at the list, and together with Jordan Troller, the Wasserman Fellow, and Elise Eupidis, the assistant curator here at the list, helped organize the forum. And the Max Wasserman Forum on Contemporary Art is a conference on topics on contemporary art that is hosted every 2 years by the MIT List Center of the Visual Arts. It was established in memory of the MIT alum Max Wasserman, who is a founding member of the Council for the Arts at MIT, and endowed through the generosity of Jean Wasserman. As this year, 2015, marks the list's 30th anniversary and the 30th anniversary of this building and the Media Lab, we decided to organize this year's forum around issues of public art, and specifically public art in the commons, sort of look at public art from different angles. As many of you know, the list oversees MIT's really extraordinary Percent for Art program, which encompasses about 60 artworks all over campus. And while looking at MIT, of course, we didn't just undertake navel gazing. We wanted to sort of look out and beyond Cambridge and MIT. And as this forum was shaping up, we decided to organize these topics around 3 different spaces and places, which we've titled the Square, the Network, and the Institution. Last night, Thomas Hirschhorn, Yasmil Raymond, and Eric Farmer discussed the Gramsci Monument, which was a participatory artwork and community project that took place in the Bronx in 2012 on not exactly a town square, but a public site and a gathering space. And today, we're sort of shifting our geopolitical focus, and we'll discuss the square as a site of conflict in recent revolutionary and protest movements, with a particular eye on Turkey and Egypt and the ways in which artists, filmmakers, and writers have participated in and engaged with these movements. After our panelists give a presentation, we'll be engaging with these topics a bit more broadly in relationship to public space and social practice. As the Chicago-based artist Theaster Gates, whose work focuses on the south side of Chicago, has said, that spatial movement and political rights are intertwined, meaning that our rights are infringed upon when a space isn't available for protest, which I think is something to think about and talk about further. So I'm delighted to introduce our 3 panelists today, which are Philip Rizk, Jasmina Metwaly, and Hakan Topal. You have their bios on your handout, but I will give you a little bit of information. Jasmina is an artist and filmmaker based in Cairo. Her works have been shown internationally, including an exhibition such as Cairo Documenta and the Yogia Biennial. She is a member of the media collective Mazarine, which was formed during the Egyptian Revolution in 2011. And so is Philip Rizk, who is a filmmaker and writer based in Cairo. His texts have appeared in many places online and off, including this book called Uncommon Grounds, New Media and Critical Practices in North Africa and the Middle East. Together, they directed the film Out on the Street. And some of you might have seen an installation version of this film in the German pavilion at the Venice Biennale that is still on view for another week or so. This film is also currently traveling the international festival circuit. And they'll be talking about that project a little bit. Hakan Topal is an artist with a very MIT-appropriate background. He has degrees in engineering, sociology, and the visual arts. He's based in Brooklyn, grew up in Ankara, and his work has been shown very widely internationally, including the 2001 Venice Biennale, the Istanbul Biennale, ZKM Karlsruhe, MoMA PS1, and many, many more. And Hakan will be speaking first this morning, and afterwards, Jasmina and Philip will be presenting together, and then we gather up again as a group.
Hello, everybody. I was going to just start talking, but yes, last night, I know probably most of you followed the news very closely. It was extremely sad, and it was hard to sleep last night. So I would like to call for a moment of silence for the victims of series of terror attacks last couple of months, which includes Suruç, Ankara, Beirut, Baghdad, Sinai, Silvan, and Paris. So, first of all, I would like to thank MIT List Center, Henriette, and Jordan for inviting me. It's already fantastic dialogues with the colleagues who we were speaking last day or so, and I'm hoping that we are going to continue this dialogue and discussion. So, as Henriette mentioned, that I studied engineering, and I have civil engineering, and I became and obsessed in self-expression. And of course, this was very much related with my activism in college. And today, I'm gonna, of course, the subject is the square. And the subject is the Gezi uprising and how, and then what's happening in Turkey and also in the broader Middle Eastern context. And I would like to speak 3 projects that I realized last 15 years. I believe that these projects kind of intertwined and reflects in different kinds of moments that kind of paved the way to Gezi uprising. And first project that I did was actually, it was after the 99 Adapazarı earthquake. It's called A Catastrophe, on the outside, same inside. So in 99, I was working in Ankara, at the university, and then when the earthquake hit, the state could not respond to the scale of the event. And of course, many of you know what happened in Hurricane Katrina. And it's very interesting, when catastrophes happens, it kind of like betrays the vulnerabilities of the societies. But at the same time, it poses the question of the state itself as an institution. What is the state for, right? So when, of course, I did this extensive travels in the region, first with the engineers as a kind of a research project, then started thinking about, like, what, as a photographer and videographer at the time, thinking about what am I gonna make with these footage, which is interesting, right? As an artist, you always question the point of urgency. What can I do? And I feel like as artists, we always come to the urgency zones the latest, right? First, the emergency workers goes, the police is there, then the TV cameras, then the reporters, then the long-term social workers, then the construction workers. And I feel like artists always late, and this is a kind of a strategical choice. So after a year, we went to, I say we, not because I'm royal, because I worked as a collective for a long time. So I use this we interchangeably with I, because I believe that any kind of artistic work requires some sort of an intellectual dialogue. And it requires some sort of a circle that you can bounce your ideas with. So this project is about, like, thinking about taking large format photographs and thinking about the construction and the craze of construction and the vulnerability of the state by just looking at these dump grounds of the of the older buildings that was demolished. So it was kind of like the kind of meditative photographs thinking about that structure, organizations, etc. And then these are a couple of the pictures that I took during the earthquake. So the interesting part, the reason that I'm showing this project is because the government, so the catastrophes create an opportunity, right? Catastrophes provide an opportunity for us to think a new life, new society, because it's kind of a tabula rasa moment, right? Thinking about Hurricane Katrina or think about tsunami. I was in Miyagi Prefecture this summer, did some research about that area. So when everything is erased, how we are going to reimagine the society and then build environment, right? When the organizations, the civil society is late to respond, and this is what happens. Basically, this housing complex is developed by TOKİ, which is the Public Housing Development Administration in Turkey, and the government used the earthquake zoning laws in order to reimagine large-scale gentrification in various parts of the city. So this is interesting because this is public housing, right? Public housing, it is directly related with the social insecurity of the public. So a neoliberal government came in 2002 and utilized both this public housing administration, but also thinking the city as a kind of erasable canvas, so that they could reimagine and reestablish the neoliberal order. So, and this is one of the first project. Second project that I'm going to show is about Bergama in Turkey. And probably Henriette is quite familiar because this is kind of Pergamon Museum is located in the kind of the very center of Berlin. And when they established the Pergamon Museum, at the time the Germans considered this kind of the representative museum of the new German society, right? So, and the city of Bergama, where the Pergamon temple is taken from, has been between 1997 to 2006 has been a part of a great controversy. So I'm just going to read the short text that I wrote to be fast. Since the neoliberal Islamist Erdogan government came to power in 2002, there has been a wave of privatization and appropriation of natural resources. Numerous large-scale gentrification projects were implemented despite public opposition with direct police violence. For instance, one of the most renowned resistances in Turkey was staged at the city of Bergama. After a long legal battle, the Turkish government was allowed to operate a gold mine that utilizes a dangerous cyanide leaching process. Villagers organized themselves against the illegal governmental intrusion. Over the years, with the help of activists and lawyers, the people of Bergama repeatedly won the legal battle against the gold mine. The Turkish constitution protects the livelihood of the people. However, the Erdogan government passed consecutive executive orders to essentially circumvent the juridical system. Ultimately, Koza İpek Holding, who had closer ties to conservative government, started to operate the mine in 2005. In many respects, the Bergama gold mine was one of the first major political defeats for the people who tried to defend their commons. At the time, many liberal intellectual figures in the Turkish context, the liberals can be considered as an offshoot of neoconservatism, provided support to the government despite the fact that there has been ongoing massive privatization. In part, some saw the Erdogan government's struggle to grasp control of public institutions as a justified move against the ancient regime, which was represented by the secularist elite and the Turkish republicanism known as Kemalists. At the time, the fight against the so-called deep state characterized the public agenda. The deep state was initiated largely as a journalistic term, characterized by a mafia-like organization within the state which sought the overthrow of the government. The project for us, when we started this project, it was about neoliberalism and how neoliberalism works. So, of course, at the time, the study of neoliberalism was quite in fashion, and we were all reading Karl Polanyi, maybe after a long time. And Karl Polanyi actually talks about three fictitious commodities that if you treat those commodities, the very fundamental qualities of those destroyed. And one of them is labor. Obviously, if you treat labor as a commodity, which is slavery, right? The second is if you treat money as commodity, which leads a kind of a destruction of the society itself, which we experienced in 2008, right? When you speculate with the money, is the speculation with the money and the stock market is actually speculation with the livelihood of the people. And the third, land. So when you build over the land, land is a fictitious commodity because you cannot reproduce it. Once you take over, you build on it, or you extract the goods inside of it, then you cannot recover it. That's a permanent damage. So we consider this as a kind of an ethical question, right? As an artist, obviously, I'm a photographer, and I do a lot of technical stuff that consequently has an ethical consequences, right? I'm using chemical processes at the time that damages environment. So how do I justify my actions? So you don't need to turn down the lights, but these are series of. So in order to understand, okay, can you turn down a little bit? Okay. So it can run, and because I don't want to take too much time already, I'm feeling that I'm going too fast. But in order to do a project, we cannot just simply point out that the issues of extraction of the valuables from the ground, right? One of the cases is the archaeological objects. The other one is the gold. Obviously, Germans at the end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, very much interested in the treasures, not the archaeological knowledge, right? They basically came as a kind of treasure hunters and then took all the valuables out and then left a void behind. And the second one is the gold mining, and the gold mining can be considered like tar sand production or fracking, right? We take a particular point in time, we take a kind of an authoritative gesture as a society deciding to destroy that land. In order to point out this impossibility, I mean, the question of ethics, basically we get permission from the Pergamon Museum to video shoot. But what we did instead, illegally displaced the archaeological objects. So if you, on the top left, you see where the Zeus temple is taken from. That is the trees that replaced that void. And the second one, you see the mount. That underneath, there's a big hole, right? And then two videos that shows a kind of a performative act that happened at the Pergamon site itself. So we basically destroyed the objects and turned over the rocks and damaged very minute, but nevertheless damaged the archaeological remains. So on top of it, we decided to display earth from that region, because normally you display the gold in the window shops, right? So we decided to take 10 tons of earth and then display it in the gallery itself as a kind of showing the gold itself as a kind of a valuable. And they calculated that there should be I think 20, 30 grams of gold in that earth. So These are some of the pictures. And we were very much thinking about the idea of the social justice. And of course, like when you are doing such interventions, like the social justice has to be forefront of thinking process. And Nancy Fraser talks about social justice as a kind of a tripod. One of them is the cultural recognition. In Turkey, especially in Turkey, of course, there's a huge problem with the Kurdish population, and their rights are not recognized. And the other one is the political representation, that people has to be properly represented in the political system. And the third one is the economic equality. Without thinking those three issues, we cannot argue a kind of a social justice. But on top of that, we argue that there's a kind of a fourth layer has to be considered, the rights of the things, right? Especially now after Documenta, 2 years ago, this whole thinking about the ecology from the point of view of the things, living and non-living things. I mean, we did that project in 2006, not knowing much about new materialism. Obviously, it came from the discussion about Karl Polanyi. So the last project, I know that I'm a little, am I going to, it's fine? Okay, good. So the third project that I think that is very, very important, that in terms of the citizens' relationship with the state, and is the Roboski massacre. So in 2011, December 2011, Turkish UAV spotted a bunch of people crossing Iraq-Turkish border. So basically they said there are tons of different theories about it. It could be, the information could have been passed from the Americans, but they decided that one of those people were one of the commanders of the guerrilla group PKK. So government decided to attack those groups. And they realized that after attacking the group, they realized that 34 of the people who died were all villagers, no terrorists. So it was so-called collateral damage. I mean, if you follow the news, recently American planes bombed a hospital in Kunduz region in Afghanistan. This is the Doctors Sans Frontières, right? So, and of course, I've been to region multiple times. It's for me thinking about, maybe I should just go, yeah. Okay. So I went to, since 2000, I'm going to Kurdistan, and I did a lot of projects about the region and the specificity of the Kurdish problem, but also more deeply in the archaeological and historical context, thinking about that region as a kind of a multi-layered, historically and archaeologically complex site. So in 2012, I went to Roboski village and in August, and I stayed with one of the people that they lost their son. I stayed with them. That's the mom that I took multiple silent portraits. And the thing that I am not, the thing that I'm showing this is not that I am kind of a representative of this, right? For me, the interesting part, these villagers were, their social and political agency were incredible. They organized themselves, and they staged, of course, this was a big event for Turkey. They organized themselves, and they were active political agents within the movements that they were part of, right? And even recently, one of the persons, Ferhat Encu, who elected as a parliamentarian to the Turkish parliament. So which is incredible. That person, that he was 19 years old when I met him, and it was the way that they defended their rights and the way that they they became active political agents in the discussions, consecutive discussions. For me, it was very interesting. And in 2013, I was in Istanbul. And I was interviewing a bunch of people about Roboski because I was developing this project. And people were extremely kind of, I'm not going to show the video, but people were extremely furious, and hopeless in a way that because they thought that it's happening over and over again, we are losing the battle over and over again. And in May 28th, on Facebook, I was looking to Facebook, and a bunch of my friends actually were camping at Gezi Park. And I was like, oh, like, and some people were like even from Portugal, and a lot of artists from Istanbul art community were there. So, which is incredible. Like there was something was kind of brewing, but the 31st of May, the government attacked these peaceful protesters and they burned their tents, and they started, and this ignited, sorry, I had a sore throat. This ignited an incredible backlash from people. So that was the reason was they kind of protesting is that they were, the government wanted to build a kind of a shopping mall in a kitsch Ottoman style by erasing the park and building that, kind of a replica of an Ottoman barracks of the 19th century. So of course, I mean, I'm not going to tell this, probably you know the story, like things get really big, millions of people went to protest. And in New York, we also like started to organize, and I woke up that morning and I established a Facebook group saying that let's just meet. And I started contact with some of the friends at the Occupy Wall Street, and then we started coordinating. And in 6 hours, that Facebook page distributed to 200,000 people, and 20,000 people said that they would kind of come. So we basically did a huge protest in Zuccotti Park, and thousands of people showed up. And over the years, what we did is to kind of like develop a continuity. We established a Gezi platform, NYC, and we, with Michael Hart, with a lot of theorists, we decided to think what to do next, and what we need to do in order to kind of sustain this kind of solidarity, right? So we organized hundreds of events, but since I don't have the time, perhaps I'm going to leave some of the issues, discussions that what is next to basically to the discussion session, right? So thank you very much.
Thank you for coming this morning. I will be presenting a presentation of Jasmina and mine, and then we'll be answering questions together later on. A square draws upon other squares, allowing closed crowds to dynamically expand. The square, the street, the factory, the rooftop, crowds that spontaneously seize everyone and everything within reach, creating a multitude of attitudes, surging their way outwards in times of celebration and shifting their way inwards in times of resistance. There is no limit to how crowds grow and where they move, streaming into spaces where one loses the sense of a comprehensive direction. In 2011, when we first started making short videos and posting them online, there was an urgency to register the ongoing struggles from the perspective of the street, with the intention of passing on information. Egyptian TV channels, public and private, were maniacally propagating state narratives in the hope of regaining control over the enraged masses. People were angry because of the rising cost of living, for the never-ending impunity of the police that used violence and torture without accountability. There was a rage because of the increasing exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few at the top. The channels had some success. After all, following the accumulating moment of the first 18 days of protest, the same military regime simply reincarnated its power, always with a new face. Then it was called the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. But for many of us, the 18 days were only the beginning. The battles continued on the street. A constant fight against security forces pitting bodies, stones, and Molotov cocktails against the state's arsenal of weaponry. In parallel, we ran an information war against the lies that sought to drive us back into a life of submission and silence. Protests and battles continued influencing our work and the way in which images were conceived. These images were not mere documentations of what happened, neither were they only created to give a testimony to the event and their participants. Certainly, they were made to reclaim a narrative, to tell a story, a type of counter-propaganda. With a focus on detail and evidence, they are created as a form of proof of forensic value, taking target at the doubting audiences. Our role was simple in a way: to document, to archive, to edit, to give something back to the street. But reaching the target audience was anything but simple. The public, the recipients and judges of images, information, and narratives, were thrown into battles over their very existence. One such moment was the Maspero massacre in October of 2011, when the military attacked a march protesting the regime's crackdown on a previous protest that had demanded the rights of Christians. Within minutes of the bloody attacks, state television convoluted the event, claiming the protesters were armed, had themselves kidnapped the military vehicles that crushed protesters, and that Christians were attacking the state's glorious military. The generals were inciting for a sectarian war to cover over their own crimes. The video collective, we were active at the time, Mosurin, had put out their first video after that massacre that sought to reveal the lies, entailing footage collected from protesters in the march, juxtaposed against the TV's propaganda, and testimonies censored from the public. The footage was from within the crowds, up close and blurry, capturing moments of the brutality of the violence within our frame. Their footage was from the perches of TV buildings up above, a strong voice narrating carefully edited, steady images. They had newspapers, radio, and TV channels. We had our small networks, made use of the internet, but that was not enough. In the midst of violence, there was an opportunity, an unprecedented moment to create a different kind of debate around ways of disseminating information. When the squares were taking a break from being battlefields, for short periods, they would turn into open-air cinemas, with screens gathering audiences and protesters, allowing for discussions, seeking some kind of revelation. In these short periods of time, people still owned these fragmented pieces of the city. They were utopian and longing for a utopian new reality. When the regime fought back, these events were no longer possible, pushing their participants into forming closed and private crowds, or no crowds at all. Leading up to the elections and the victory of the Muslim Brotherhood was a vast campaign that brought images to the streets. Kezebun, liars, was a campaign that took this information battle to a new level. Across the country, street corners, coffee shops, and living rooms were transformed into makeshift cinemas to expose the lies of the regime that claimed that with the fall of Mubarak, violence against protesters had come to an end. The internet and social media were never enough. People had to meet, join together on the street to keep the momentum going. When Jasmina and I were not in the midst of these battles, the two of us spent a lot of time going to factories where we met with workers who demanded what they were being cheated of: decent wages, better working conditions, medical care, a decent life. A few contemplated taking over their workspaces, provoking visionary ideas of self-administration. Many striked, marched in proclamation of their angry desires. In those moments of coming together, they were not overcome by fear of the possible consequences of their actions. In the factories, like everywhere else, it was as if there was nothing more to lose after January 25th. Security agents were looming around every corner, but only the gathering of large numbers of people could prevent their attacks. People created public committees, political youth groups. The movement of people influenced others, and spaces of protest were created in neighborhoods, schools, universities, and on the doorsteps of ministries and parliament. Everything was happening amidst the chaos, but not without a purpose. In the end, too many desires remained unmet. Following the coup of July 3rd, 2013, the two of us threw ourselves into a single project to avoid the depression that comes with such harsh repression. Unlike what its name infers, our film Out on the Street, Barra fi Shera, took place in a tent on a rooftop in downtown Cairo. This is an important detail, for in the film we remain within the realm of fiction, shifting back and forth between enactment and reenactment, created by storytellers, the workers' actors. These stories are real stories, but we quickly move from the realm of retelling and reenacting occurred events to experiencing in the moment, creating new scenarios, happening in real time. This is what we call enacting. There on the roof, over an hour away from their homes, the actors have a space to disconnect from their families, work, neighborhoods, and the all too familiar street. All responsibilities towards institutions, whether of society or the state, were put on hold during these short encounters on the rooftop. The skeleton of the narrative of Out on the Street is based on one case of a privatized factory that acts as a case study for structural policies of privatization carried out in Egypt intensely since the 90s, as in so many places around the world. In February of 2011, during the height of the revolt, we went to film in a factory on the banks of the Nile occupied by its workers. One of the workers said, "Today I'm not imprisoned, not from inside or out, and I have the freedom to say it. It is exactly this that they are demanding in Tahrir Square, and I'm not against them, I'm with them." Abdullah has cancer, high blood pressure, and diabetes. Mahmoud, another worker who had already been kicked out of the factory during the privatization process, told us, "Like this, we are left out on the street." We filmed their protest, posted it online, screened it in their factory, but weeks later the military kicked them out and sealed off the site. What had our documentation done? We told the story, shared the struggle, told of the courage and the defeat. With Out on the Street, we wanted to move beyond that. The factory became the trope, the mold. For us, this public resource of the factory could be anything: land, work, home, jobs, or life itself that is eaten on behalf of the interests of the powerful. On the rooftop, we began moving from reenacting scenes loosely based on our research story to enacting new imaginary scenarios. We played games, learned to work in a group and direct each other, but also how to let go of certain knowledge and allow something else to happen, where acting and playing is real, not suppressed. The participants stopped repeating the scenes as repetition that evokes the acting as professional actors would, rehearsing and adapting the roles they play to become more believable. Rather, they took on a single role that they constantly returned to and improvised. They became actors in a story, in real-life events. Fear started to creep in, and nerves ran high. Positions changed, conflict broke out, and some of them escaped and then returned to the stage, but hesitantly. History takes another turn, and here we leave the script for an imaginary world. During the period of the making of the film, our preconceived notions towards the project were challenged, and we had to let go and focus on the moment of the making. As we transition from reenactment to enactment, the movement of the camera around the bodies of the actors, like previously in the streets and factories, became urgent. The realms of protest, the gestures, where the person asking the questions and the person behind the camera have a single chance to capture a moment that is not conceived through rehearsal. I will show you a short clip from this project and then just conclude.
قاعدين على القهوة شوية.
في مع بعض كده بنتكلم بس في الموضوع.
شغالين ايه طيب؟
شغالين في المصنع يا باشا.
مصنع. ساكن فين؟
ساكن في العربية يا باشا.
وانت؟
19 يا ريس.
وانت؟ المساك.
السيدة.
لا بتاع سيدة انت كده. معاك أي حاجة؟ ماشي ما تشرب. مش أي حاجة يا جدعان. دي مناظر حد معاه حاجة؟ أنت عامل كده ليه؟
مش من السهرة يا ريس ولا ايه اصلا يا باشا
والله ايه بس تسمع كتير يعني.
يا ريس.
وانت يا باشا شكلك كده غريبة. بتاع سيدة.
يا باشا راجل على قدي، مربي عيالي، مكان بقت عشان اموت. شوف يا باشا لو معايا أي حاجة.
معكش أي حاجة يعني خالص؟
شوف
طب انت كده. ايه يا عم ورمضانك كده ليه يا عم؟ ايه يا عم شايل هم ولا ايه؟ شوية؟ وانت مالك بتنزل كده ليه؟ ايه كده؟
طيب مين حضرتك؟ طب نشوف الكارنيه طيب ممكن؟
برضه كارنيه؟
معلش.
هو ايه الشعب كل ما يروح يقول لي كارنيه
متأكد يعني ما مش أي حد هيجي يقول لنا أنت فين؟
كل شيء بطاقتك وريتها لك.
انت اسكت خالص، انت لسه تعالى كلم الباشا. مش اي حاجه تنزل شخصيتك؟
لا يا باشا.
ونازل من العرب من غير بطاقه؟
معلش يا باشا.
فجرته.
مش معاك كارنيه الشغل؟
تعال
يا باشا انا جاي الشغل.
بقول لك ايه يا باشا؟ معهوش بطاقه ده يا باشا، نازل من العرب ده. الرجاله بتاعت الجبل.
يا باشا انا شغال في مصنع وكده.
خش كلم الباشا، كلم الباشا ما تكلمنيش، خش بس كلم الباشا.
بيشربوا مخدرات.
مين يا باشا اللي بيشرب مخدرات؟
يا بيه أنا محاسب.
معايا أي
أنا
حاجة؟
محاسب
ايه امال الكارتيلات دي بتعملوا
دي
بيها
تذكرة مترو. كارتيلة إيه؟
الواد ده بيدخن؟
لا يا باشا شكله كده الراجل ده
معاه
محترم
سجاير ولا
يعني.
اي حاجه؟ هات الحاجه دي. برشام.
العلاج يا بيه.
الله الله الله الله الله الله.
شوف لي العلاج. روح
صليبه ده يا باشا.
ده
لا
بصليبة؟
يا باشا لا.
برشام إيه ده؟ برشام ده علاج.
فين يا عم انت؟
ده علاج.
علاج
ده
ايه؟
علاج.
علاج ايه؟ علاج ايه
ده
ده؟
علاج.
طب خلاص يبقى اسكت سيبنا نشوف شغلنا.
اتفضل يا بيه. ها
فين بتاعك؟
باشا بعد اذنك بس عايز اتكلم معاك بس بعد
يا
اذنك.
حاج خليك يا حاج وانت حد يكلمك يابا.
انت عارف كلهم زي ولاد يا باشا وشغالين معايا برضو يا باشا. مش انا قد والدك بس انا بتكلم معاك
والدك
كلمتين
ايه
يعني يا باشا.
ايه ده بس عشان تمشي؟
يعني
ينفع يعني؟
ايه ده
بتكلم
عشان تمشي؟
كلمتين محبه يعني يا باشا بس يعني.
ولا محبه ولا بتاع.
ده يعني عشان
ولا خطيبتك؟
يا باشا من عشمي فيك
يا
بس
حاج
يا
بقى
باشا.
ايدك جنبك كنت بتكلم الباشا يا حاج.
تركب معاهم ولا تتكل على الله تروح؟
طب ممكن افهم
يلا
بس
روح
بس يا
لعيالك.
باشا. طيب
روح
يركبوا ليه
لعيالك.
طيب يا باشا؟ هروح بس.
خلاص يا حاج روح حاج، روح بس عشان هو خلقه
يعني
ده
ده
النهارده يا
كل
حاج.
مشكلته
يا حاج
بطاقة
روح
يعني
بس
نروح
عند
نجيبها له
عيالك
ونيجي؟
وتعالى عند الاسم.
طب هقول لك بس
تعالى عند الاسم.
هقول لك على حاجه بس يا باشا.
اروح اجيب لك
هم
البطاقه
دول
واجي.
يعني انت عارف
اروح
دول
اجيب
ناس
البطاقة؟
كبار برضه شغالين يعني.
ماشي يا عم بقول لك
ماشي.
بس انت شوف.
وبعدين عندهم شغلهم.
هي فين يا بيه؟
روح
مرميه على
وتعالى
الطبلومه
عند
ايه؟
الاسم.
طب يا باشا انت
خد
عارف
البطاقة.
يعني.
طب انا هروحهم لك بس انت شوف.
لا انا اشوف.
تعالى لنا عند الاسم. اركب يا معلم.
عامل لي فيها ابو ظابط.
يا باشا اروح اجيبها لك من البيت.
اركب يا معلم اركب، ده انت نورتنا.
اسمك ايه؟
اسمه خلف يا باشا.
ركبه.
ترد على الباشا كده ليه؟
انا عملت حاجه يا باشا.
خليك حلو كده عشان تروح.
ماشي يا باشا.
بطاقة وبيقاوح.
5 years ago, we began taking squares back, us the rightful owners, the residents on the squares. And then, with a vengeance, the regime took away from us again in the summer of 2013, filling the morgues and prisons with bodies. All this happened with approval of the global powers, who, despite their espoused image of democracy and support of human rights, gladly sold the rulers their weapons for the sake of an interest they shared with the Egyptian generals, to regain control of the streets and squares. In parallel, in our filmmaking practice, we moved from taking the streets to taking the imaginary with our eyes on the future. Today, we work in the imaginary, but without bodies on the street, all portrayal is in vain. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for these extraordinary presentations. There are a lot of things to talk about. I was very struck, Hakan, by your remark about coming to these sites later as an artist. And of course, one of the things I was thinking about is that we, curators in art spaces, come way later than that, which is something to think about. And yet, and both of you in your presentations sort of showed different kinds of projects. One sort of more immediately in the moment activist parts of your work, of your practice, and then these projects that sort of take place with hindsight or sort of reflect, take it out of the present moment, in the case of Out on the Street or in the case of your work on the Pergamon site. And perhaps you can talk about these different modes a little bit and what those kinds of images that you produce can do. And specifically, Jasmina and Philip, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Mazarine now, how you feel about its efficacy and what it did and where the collective is now.
Go ahead.
The Musserine collective was a very important, came at a very important period when it was, like Philip was describing, it was impossible to, it was impossible to stay in the square after the 18 days. People would still gather, but it became clear that the army is back in charge and that we need to find different ways of sort of continuing with that momentum. And we looked into this idea of a collective. And the collectivity started in the square. We had, we as in protesters, videographers, everyone who was kind of involved in the footage production at the time. There was a tent, it was called the Media Tent in Tahrir, and we gathered a significant amount of footage material that kind of after the 18 days when things were over, we didn't know what to do with it later on. What happens with all that footage? What happens with that history that is going to get lost very, very quickly? And this is when we looked into finding a space where we can meet, discuss, have political meetings, a space where people can gather and feel that they can talk about organizing. And it was also a space where we edited footage, where the archive sort of where we started, we had the time to start looking into the footage and start reorganizing it, start editing and countering the state propaganda, which was at the moment extremely powerful, and it worked for so many people on so many levels because they believed that SCAF, the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, is doing the right thing. So it was clear to us that something needs to be done, and I think we when I say we, again, I'm talking about a collective which consists of filmmakers, sure, but many individuals who do very different things. There were doctors, lawyers, activists. And I think we all sort of put our own practices on hold in order to just do that. And at the time, it was very, very important. And I believe that there were protests that happened, or the videos that we made, that we disseminated over the internet, over the YouTube channel that we launched later on. We believe that it had influence on the continuity of the street protests. There were moments where these videos influenced the state narrative. There were moments where testimonies that went extremely viral, that had over 500,000 hits, these videos were noticed and recognized. And that made a big difference. Mm-hmm. There were also very sad moments where footage that was filmed from a rooftop close to the square, where a sister of a protester recognized her brother through footage that she watched online that went viral. She recognized him because of what he was wearing that day, and they couldn't find him. And then we found her, and we made a longer video with her after the death of her brother. So there's a lot of, I think, significance at the time, but also I think that the state, the authority, the police, the army, they didn't know what to do with us at the time. We were sort of somewhere in between, and there was so much going on in the street. There was so much going on in factories. We had a good year of getting away with a lot of things. Mm-hmm. That being said, apartments were raided, footage, hard drives were taken, cameras were thrown from balconies. This also happened. People were arrested. Military trials on civilians were going on that whole time. Secret military trials that were happening sort of in the undergrounds, where the general public was unaware of. So I think it was a good timing for that collective. Right now, we don't exist as a collective anymore. It was impossible to sustain ourselves for much longer. It was also dangerous to continue that way. Dangerous for the collective members, but also for the amount of footage that we have right now. We need to be careful with this material. We need to be careful where it goes, who sees it, and where it's kept. So it was. I mean, to answer your question, I think right now we're sort of on hold. We're doing things individually. But the collective is not operating anymore.
And I mean, clearly Mazarine wasn't started as an art project, but I think you were invited to show it in certain art exhibitions. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And how did you feel about, when did that happen, and how did you feel about that?
Well, at the time, we were looking at different platforms and opportunities to show what was happening. Some of us would travel and do presentations about Egypt, speak about the events and so on. But I think the art venues are not the venues really to show this kind of material. I don't know what it would be the way to curate it. Perhaps maybe there's no need to do that. Maybe they should be screened in the street or in temporary cinemas. But I don't think that. I felt like when we had, for instance, when we showed some of the footage during the Berlin Biennale in 2012, I think, I think there something really, really wrong happened during that exhibition, where the attempt to open up the art venues or the art spaces to the general public, that attempt didn't really work. It was kind of a false or missed attempt, because people are not familiar with these kinds of situations, and also this idea of occupying a space for a political event, to this kind of false occupation that happened during at the Café in Berlin, that was also very false. You don't occupy a space that is given to you for free and invite activists to sit and talk politics. It doesn't work. So
and it really didn't work. Having seen, and for those who didn't see the 2012 Berlin Biennale, which was curated by Artur Zmijewski with some other artists, was basically given over. It was the central location, KW in Berlin, was turned into like a quasi-occupied place. It was given over to various different activist organizations that were sort of presenting material, and numerous sort of documentary and more artist-style videos were shown on the different floors. And sort of also presented sort of a jumble of all kinds of different situations and conflict, horizontally and laterally, and ended up being a very strange experience. Hakan, did you want to reply?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about this issue a lot, right? Because on the one hand, we are trying to change the society, create revolution, fundamental issues about social justice. These are urgent issues that we have to develop. But on the other hand, an artistic knowledge, in my opinion, is similar to archaeological knowledge, right? We shouldn't be like treasure hunters. I think we should be like, that knowledge has to be attained with utmost care and understanding of the materials that we are dealing with. I think that's why an archaeologist has to be late, right? In Çatalhöyük, for instance, is one of the most important archaeological sites, Neolithic sites, right? Right now, archaeologists digging that, and they are imagining that they are going to be not even done in 50 years, right? They are going to be getting enough knowledge in 50 years to be able to comment on the site. So, but on the other hand, there is this urgency that I'm like Paris happened. There are a series of occupations and encampments that happened from Tahrir to Occupy Wall Street to Spain to Turkey. Then we are suddenly like thinking this temporality of these events. And I don't want to think about these events as an educational events anymore. We have to do concrete steps, right? And how we are going to do those steps. And we are obviously troubled with the problem of top to bottom organizational and state organization or any kind of museums, universities. But at the same time, we are unable to develop forms that could lead to some form of a bottom-to-top democratic organization. So when I say, we were talking yesterday, when I say top to bottom, when I say bottom to top, those bottoms are not the same thing, right? Bottoms, on the one hand, top to bottom is the people, the masses, the crowds. And the bottom on the right side, which is the bottoms that we are dealing with the activists, with the organization, that we are communicating, right? That is the singularities that forms that diversity, right? It is not the homogeneity, it is not the egality, humanistic egality, but it is precisely the difference that brings us together. And the difference, I think, in that moment of differentiation, art plays, in my opinion, an important role, right? As an artist, I have the duty, in a way, intellectual duty to be honest and be true to the subject that I am dealing with. I have the ethical responsibility to those images, not to those people, because I don't have the responsibility to those people because they are political subjects. I am not representing them. They didn't ask me to represent them. I have another responsibility because I'm creating, thinking about those images and how those images can form as some sort of a unity in a setting, in a different setting. It could be a screening, the videos that you are creating, or like installations that I'm thinking. Those are kind of the settings that I'm thinking that has to be, I mean, this is a modernist like term, but coherent in somewhat.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, of course, that topic, what you're getting at, sort of between something that is sort of a visual aesthetic or an artistic aesthetic vis-a-vis something that is a community project or sort of documentary footage, is something that came up last night and that Thomas Hirschhorn talked about very eloquently in relationship to the Gramsci monument. And of course, I'm thinking as a curator and a representative of an institution about how whether certain works can be shown successfully in a museum setting, or whether certain sort of projects can be shepherded along fruitfully by an institution. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. I was thinking about the German Pavilion in Venice, which you were part of this year, which I actually think, I mean, particularly now that the show has been on view for a few months, I find extraordinarily effective and prescient also in sort of bringing together topics of migration, of labor and shadow economies, of sort of multinational capitalism, and the sort of issues of privatization that you're dealing with. And perhaps that brings us to the film Out on the Street. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about how you experienced that project in that context of that art exhibition.
I mean, it was quite a challenge, honestly, because we'd worked on this project for almost 3 years. Mm-hmm. As an idea, we started developing it at the end of 2011, when it was a very different period. And we had just finished the film early in early this year in February. To screen it at a film festival. And we were invited to participate in the German Pavilion, which again, similar to the experience with the Mussolini videos, we were actually not that certain was the right venue for it. I mean, it's really a challenge sometimes when you're working on a project in a specific format to then change that format for a different kind of audience. And I mean, the biggest challenge for us was really just we had very little time to start envisioning that shift from a single channel projection, like what you saw here, to actually having a space to work with. I think it was really a challenge. I mean, I'm glad to hear that you think that the pavilion as such worked as a whole, but it's a huge challenge to participate in something as large as the Venice Biennial, but then a group show like the one in the German Pavilion had so many different elements to it. It was not an easy place to place this film. And maybe you want to...
I mean, the film is 70 minutes long, and to show it in an exhibition, a group exhibition setting, within, I'm talking about the German Pavilion, within the whole Biennale.
Which had countless more hours of footage too in the overall show. Yeah.
True. Yes, that's the Ocqui's kind of method to show more, and you as the person in the audience, you have the choice. But how much choice do you have when there is a film that is 70 minutes long, and how much time can you give, and how much time would one expect from the audience to? There's the question of how much would we as the filmmakers agree to, given that it's 70 minutes, and we would like people to watch it from the beginning to an end. So there are certain compromises that shouldn't be made, I think, and I'm not sure at the end if it worked. If it worked because of the length and because of the whole show. It was very layered. I mean, Tobias's work on the first floor was extremely thick, and you needed time. And that time is precious. So I'm not sure if it worked, but it was definitely I think an important thing for us, like in our practice, to think outside of the black box in that way, and to try work with the space, and to also, I mean, we re-edit the film a little bit, thinking of ways how people can come and leave and maybe come again, and I think because the film consists of footage. I mean, we only watched a short clip, but there are moments that are more documentary, when you're not sure if this is an interview or if this is a scene, but it is actually a documentary footage, something that was filmed during outside the rehearsals, but there's also footage that is filmed in the factory, for instance, by Isam, who's one of the workers from Starch and Glucose Factory, the factory that was privatized, and he's filming footage with his mobile phone, so that is also incorporated in the film. So because the film has so many different kind of facets to it, I think it can work in that way, where you enter and you watch a scene, or you watch two scenes and then you leave. But you can also watch it as a whole, because there's a story that you follow, there's a narrative. And the story is a story of privatization, and it's a story of a factory that was just privatized, and there's a new owner, and it's about the dynamics between the new owner and the workers. So there's a story, but it was definitely challenging.
So this is maybe a slightly different question, but so the workers, actors that you're working with in that film, that sort of took place over an extended period of time, and presumably some close relationships. What happened to them now? What are they doing now?
Well, they're back. I mean, again, we would meet. It was during an extended period of time that we worked on the project as a whole. But at the beginning, we spent a lot of the time close with the actual workers from Starch and Glucose Factory, with whom we wanted to make the film, to make the reenactment. But that didn't work out, and this is when we looked for other people from these neighborhoods, from Helwan and from Tibin, which are the neighborhoods around the factory. And this is when we came across this group of people that you saw in the clip. So with those guys, we only worked for
5 months.
5 months.
Okay.
And it was also on and off because of a number of things. And they would come to the rooftop a few times a week within that period. And this is when we would spend around 5 hours together. So they had their day jobs, and then afterwards they would come and we would do this thing on the roof. But it was definitely fun, I think. When at the end of the project, when we showed them the film, they were very surprised with how it looked at the end, because the process for them was something completely different. And once you sit down and you edit, it's like you're working on a new project in a way. And I think they enjoyed the process so much when they saw the final film thing. They were asking, when is it that we're going to meet again? Maybe we can work on another film again and do something together. It was fun. And I think this was something also refreshing to us. I think our presentation was very kind of ta-da, very depressing as well. And I think that film isn't. And maybe you can't see that in that clip, but there's also a lot of playing and jokes and pretending. Yes, we're in touch. the guy who played the boss, you can't see him in that clip. He's extraordinary. He wants to pursue his career as an actor. And he went to an audition that was organized by, or he was linked through our producer. So they definitely want to do it again.
We have about 15 minutes left, so I think it's probably time to open it up to some questions or comments from the audience. We have 2 microphones on the left and right, I think. There is a question.
Thank you. Well, this was extraordinary. And it's a question actually for Philip and Jasmina. I was thinking about the audiences for that film, at least for the clip that we saw. And it was incredibly powerful. And I'm wondering, is there any segment of an audience that would be called, let's say, political, to whom this film should or could or might be shown? And I'm talking about organized politics, whether it's at the city level or the state level or the whatever, because there is an impact here. And it's one thing to talk about it as a work of art, and it is extraordinary as that. But also another thing to talk about it or think about it as a political lever for change, for whatever. And I don't know if this is possible, certainly in the environment within which this was shot, but it just struck me as, could we push it a little bit further?
I mean, the project went through different kind of phases. So at some stage, we had actually envisaged it as a kind of theatrical performance that would be performed on the street in the neighborhoods where they're from, as well, and then that performance would be filmed and integrated into a film. When we started thinking of the project in 2011, that was actually imaginable because we were starting to take control of the streets, and we could do events without being attacked by the police or various other forms of thugs related to the state. Of course, that changed by the time we started really focusing on the film in 2013. And at this point, I mean, you know, the first people who watched the film after we'd finished editing it were the actors themselves. And it is our biggest priority to show it again in their neighborhoods. And actually, just a few weeks ago, we managed to get this film past the censorship in Egypt. So this hasn't been screened in Egypt yet. Yeah, because we got this permit, and we had to
self-censor.
We had to be quite strategic about how we submitted it to the censor, because there are certain scenes, not that you saw today, that we know it wouldn't pass the censorship. So we left the cut as it is, but dropped the sound in certain scenes. So rather than having them censor our film, we are censoring it ourselves. But you see, I mean, the lips are moving. I think in some cases you can read what is being said, but we hope that this way we kind of surpass taking responsibility for something spoken, because it was never spoken, as well as, of course, protecting the actors. But I think as an audience, a creative audience, you can usually put together what is actually being said. So we'll be screening, the plan is the middle of January, we'll be screening in Egypt for the first time. We're screening in Tunis later this month. And we have a plan to screen in the neighborhood where the actors are from. There's only one cinema in the neighborhood. And I mean, we'd really like it to be in a cinema so that it appears as a regular kind of theatrical experience. I mean, rather than it being in some kind of youth club or NGO space, which would be our next option if we can't do that. But in a cinema, I mean, you have a regular audience, and they're not expecting something like this. And we really hope it works.
Hi there. Thanks so much. I actually kind of want to go back a little bit to something that maybe Henriette started by kind of bringing up at the very beginning, which is about all these different ways that you practice that kind of ride the line in some ways between, for lack of a better word, just sort of image and action, or activism and art. And I'm kind of curious about, with your work, when, if you have your kind of, if each of you sort of have your own internal line of maybe when you cross from one to the next, or how you determine when you're making art, or when you're doing social justice work or activism, and how you sort of reconcile or make sense of that blurry space, and or if it's even important at all to you.
Hakan?
Maybe to you.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting, like a thin line that I think that an artist should never ever cross, and that is the line that being an actor, like instead of like the one that who's dealing with the things in the world and making sense of it, to be part of those things, because an artist's ultimate responsibility, in my opinion, is the things, but these things is beings and non-living things and objects and the stones and whatever the materials that we are engaging with, to make them free. So if you cross that line, which is that becomes that activist line, right? That becomes, then you are on the stage. And because an artist always problematizes the stage, because when you are doing something, the stage is the something that is the thing. But when you are on the stage, then you are an actor, then you are vulnerable. And you are part of those things, right? And I'm always careful about that distinction, in a way, that when I'm an activist, then I have equality. I cannot organize things the way that I organize as an art project, because ultimately an artwork is a hierarchy of images and things, and there is certain ethical responsibility to the hierarchy. But when you are, as an activist, working with other people, then your relationship with them, that becomes a political relationship that cannot be assumed as an art project. Well, in my opinion, of course, there are tons of different art projects that does that, right? And I'm not even critical to that, because the outcome of it, the effect of it should be considered. Especially last night, for instance, Thomas, it was incredible work, a lot of like issues with the work, but Thomas is honest about those issues, right? And an Arab man could never ever do that project in Bronx. A European white male could have done it, right? A Turkish man cannot do a project like that in Switzerland. So there are issues like that, but he's extremely honest and reflexive about these processes. That whole thing becomes an interesting, like, a project to think about. So that I am certainly not criticizing the approaches. For me, I don't want to cross that line, because I have a different way of working. Like I'm working with images and things, ultimately.
Happy to leave you.
So I have a question that touches on something each of you have been talking about. So if artists, as you said, Hakan, are always late to the scene, and then as Henriette said, curators and museums are even later, something that Philip and Yasmin talked about how today we work in fictions. What about the timing of the entry of work in fictions?
Come again?
Sorry. So I'm thinking about So taking sort of bits of what each of you have said, this timing of a work in fiction in a museum space, say, maybe not so much the site, you were talking about the difficulties of KW or the biennial, but the timing and the sort of the timing of the thing in whichever space is appropriate for the thing.
I know what you mean. I'm not sure how to answer that question, sort of across the board. But I mean, perhaps anecdotally, when I was working at the Whitney Museum of American Art when 9/11 happened, and that was, of course, the dawn of the cell phone video era, so people didn't have that much private footage of it. And we would be within days of it happening and being back in the office. I was working at what was once the Film and Video Portfolio. We were getting all these phone calls from people saying, from artists, I'm an artist, and I have some footage of this event, and don't you think you should show it because you're the Whitney Museum of American Art? And we were kind of like, well, yes, send it, but actually no, because you have the same footage that we've all just seen for hours and hours on television. There wasn't really any other sort of distance or particular artistic engagement with the material, much less fictionalization, which has now happened to some degree. So, and then again, in the case of Mazarine, which clearly wasn't an art project, but this is sort of like first-hand footage shot in the moment that is, what we now sometimes call citizen journalism or documentary or something that is actually, or that was once called alternative media, that is sort of an image production that you can't see on the sort of main channels. And does that fit into a museum? I don't know. I don't know really how to answer that question other than on a case-by-case basis, perhaps. And I think maybe as a curator at a museum, sometimes we just have to kind of take a chance on something.
But there is something about timing, as in when things were happening and we were filming them, it was important to keep it that way and to be consistent in that way and to draw that line. And we didn't succeed in the drawing of the line always. We were busy working on the video. Someone wanted to show them. We were like, sure, show them. It's important. This is happening right now. So we weren't in the right mindset to kind of have these analyses going on. And I think after when that period was kind of over, it became clear to us that it's time to do things differently. That this kind of urgency, and I think this is when the collective sort of kind of naturally disseminated and people went to places, because we were very strong during. I'm not saying that now the way things are and things develop politically in the region are not urgent. They are, but it's becoming more and more difficult to, or even if it was allowed, I think even looking at the images today and remembering these images, there's so much images out there. There's so much that is being told, and it sort of deceives the purpose of making it in the first place. It made sense now, but we did a lot of videos about worker struggles, and they made sense for a while, and at some point it's almost as if you're revisiting the same story over and over and over again with different protagonists. And what do you do with that? Who's your audience? Who will watch this again? And so there's also a moment where you need to stop and kind of take a step back and think of different ways of working with that. And I think fiction, and I think this is when, in a way, these very urgent videos or the very raw footage also gets fictionalized when it stops being, when it's not urgent anymore, when it doesn't have that one-to-one kind of effect. When the cinema Tahrir, the cinemas that were in the square, the temporary cinemas, there was one shot, one still that we showed from that situation where screening. When I remember in March 2011, we showed a video of the army entering Tahrir Square and arresting people. And that screening happened at the end of March. 9th of March, this is when the army entered. And that confrontation in the same place where the army entered was very important at the time, because people didn't know, although they were in the very place, they didn't know what happened just a few weeks ago. There was the glorification of the army, and there was a moment where the audience is shocked, and they stand up and they start shouting at the screen, saying these are lies, this didn't happen, this was photoshopped. And then the discussion opens and people start arguing with one another. Like, no, I was there, I was in there, this is where it was right here, right behind the screen, it happened right here. And there's an element of that. But once the event or this is over, you're left with the sort of the leftovers of that, the spectacles, the fictionalized truth. And in that way, these are also, these are fictions too. And it's okay. I mean, it's okay to leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. Probably time for one more question.
Talk briefly about the danger that the two of you encountered. At what point did you realize, I can't do this anymore? It's my life. I mean, you mentioned that the thugs and getting, 5 hours each night on a rooftop. Did the army bother you at all? Did they come at times and say, hey, you guys have to stop this? And at what point did you realize, I can't do this, we can't do this anymore?
There's two very different periods, right? In the Muslimin period, it was something constantly on your mind. You know, you're going to the street in whatever capacity. You calculate the cost somehow, which you try to, but you can't. You know, it's a matter of often it's a matter of luck whether you come back or you don't. Or in what shape you come back. As far as out on the street, one of the reasons the whole thing takes place in a tent is because this was the only space that we could kind of secure. We had our studio space on this rooftop, and we pretty much had exclusive access to it. So we set up this tent so that it couldn't be seen from the outside. And
also it was a larger studio space that was it was under the umbrella of the townhouse gallery. So there was also this aspect to it. We could get away with a lot of things.
It was a private space.
It's a private space, and we have a studio there, so people really didn't. There was no danger in that sense whatsoever.
But despite this, there was somebody who worked in that space who actually, at some point, we mentioned in the presentation that some of the actors got scared. And so someone who was working in the space actually started spreading rumors about what we were doing and that the space was being watched by the police. And this is part of the reason why some of the actors left us for a while, and it took us a while to convince them to come back. Because even when you're not in direct contact with the state, it's always looming wherever you are. Even when you're in a closed apartment, you never know who might be listening or who might be telling what. And a lot of people have been arrested in that way, or have had the police come searching their apartments. We have friends that this happened to, because of someone spreading information. And I think we got lucky that the film went the way that it did, but there was a certain moment where we weren't sure if we could even continue.
And we weren't also sure if should this become part of the project, or should this be somehow mentioned, or should the project stop right here and we leave it at this. But then again, there was the responsibility towards the participants, and the fact that not just to responsibility towards it, but it was the fact that we agreed that we're making a film, and they want to play in a film, and that's the agreement. So let's finish it, and let's let's make it about the story and not make it about without exposing that. It was about getting away from that, actually.
Okay. Well, I think it's about time to finish. Hakan asked the very big question, what to do next or what happens next, which is a big question that we won't be able to answer now. Thank you all so much for coming and listening. We are serving lunch outside for the participants, everybody here. The next panel is at 2 o'clock, called The Network, and I hope to see you all back. Thank you.